Have you ever imagined finding out that the very person you despise the most is secretly the one protecting everything you love? Tonight, you'll hear the story of Richard Kane, a billionaire who believed money could buy loyalty, respect, and even love, until he uncovered a truth that shattered his arrogance forever. Stay with me until the end, because what Richard discovers about his humble employee will leave you speechless. Richard Kane walked through the marble corridors of his Long Island mansion as if he were a king surveying his kingdom. The chandeliers sparkled above his head, reflecting a cold gleam in his sharp eyes. For Richard, wealth wasn't just comfort. It was power, control, and the invisible wall that separated him from the rest of the world. The staff scurried whenever he entered a room. They knew his silence was more dangerous than his voice. A single impatient glance from Richard was enough to make them quicken their pace. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone demanded obedience. Laura Kane, his wife, watched him from a distance with a quiet sorrow. Unlike Richard, she believed true nobility was found in kindness, not intimidation. Yet whenever she tried to soften his cold demeanor, he dismissed her words with indifference. Over the years, her voice had become just another echo, lost inside the mansion's enormous halls. Their children grew up surrounded by luxuries, private tutors, designer clothes, vacations in Europe, but lacked the warmth of a father's affection. Richard thought providing material comfort was enough. He failed to see how often his children craved something money could never buy: his time, his love, his presence. Among the staff was James Carter, the mansion's most humble worker. He was quiet, discreet, and invisible in Richard's eyes. James swept the floors, carried supplies, and fixed what was broken. He never complained, never argued. To Richard, James wasn't a man. He was a shadow, a figure without importance. "Keep your distance," Richard once snapped when he noticed James smiling at his youngest daughter after she handed him a flower from the garden. "You're not here to play. Do your job and nothing else." And the words cut deep, but James only lowered his head and returned to work. For the rest of the staff, it was a routine humiliation, nothing unusual in that house. But Laura, watching silently, felt her stomach turn. She often wondered, why couldn't her husband see the quiet dignity in that man? James arrived first every morning and was always the last to leave at night. His tasks were heavy, but he performed them with a calmness that irritated Richard. To the billionaire, silence meant weakness, but to James, silence was protection. It was the only way to remain invisible in a world that had never given him a voice. The other staff members trusted James more than anyone else. If bread ran out in the kitchen, he would quietly share his own. If someone fell ill, James was the first to help. He never demanded recognition, never sought praise. Even the children felt drawn to him, though Richard always shut down any attempt at connection. But there was something about James that nobody fully understood. At night, after the day's work ended, he never left the mansion right away. He gathered his tools, checked the locks, and then disappeared into the shadows. The others noticed, but no one dared to ask. Laura, however, paid attention. More than once, she saw him from the window, walking with a purpose beyond his duties. His steps carried a weight, as though he bore responsibilities no one else could see. She sensed there was more to James than his humble position allowed. Richard, of course, never cared, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. He ruled his home like a fortress, obsessed with control. But when he finally realized that James was hiding something, the seed of suspicion took root. For a man like Richard Kane, ignorance was intolerable. One evening, as James finished tidying the tool shed and prepared to leave, Richard lingered on the balcony. He noticed the deliberate calmness in the man's movements. James wasn't simply ending his shift. He looked ready, prepared. Richard narrowed his eyes. Minutes later, James slipped quietly through the gate. His figure faded into the night, but Richard couldn't shake the unease stirring inside him. What business did a servant have lurking about after hours? Fueled by irritation and curiosity, Richard waited a few minutes, then grabbed his car keys. With the headlights off, he drove at a distance, following James through the narrow, dimly lit streets surrounding the property. Every turn, every step the man took seemed deliberate, like he was following a ritual he had performed many times before. Instead of heading home, James circled back toward the estate. Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel. What was he doing returning after hours? Why was he hiding? The billionaire parked his car behind a cluster of trees and watched. James stopped by the far edge of the property, near the old stone wall that bordered the garden. He leaned against a tree, scanning the surroundings with sharp, watchful eyes. Richard froze. For nearly 20 minutes, James stood guard like a silent sentinel. When footsteps approached from the street, a pair of strangers lurking too close, James stepped forward. His presence alone was enough to send them retreating into the darkness. Richard's chest tightened. His employee, the man he mocked and dismissed, wasn't sneaking around for himself. He was protecting the mansion, protecting his family. Back inside, Richard pretended nothing had happened. But the image of James standing alone in the shadows burned into his mind. That night, for the first time in years, the billionaire couldn't sleep. How could it be that the man he despised most was the one shielding his children from danger? And you, what would you do if you discovered that someone you had always looked down on was the only one protecting what you love the most? Hit the like button if you want to know where this story goes, because what Richard learns next will shake his world to its core. The next morning, Richard Kane sat at the breakfast table, but the usual satisfaction he felt in his empire of order was gone. His coffee turned cold as his mind replayed the sight of James standing guard in the shadows. He barely touched his plate while Laura and the children chatted quietly. Every laugh, every innocent word from his kids reminded him of the night before, and the realization was suffocating. Their safety, the very thing he prided himself on providing, had been silently safeguarded by a man he considered beneath him. When James entered the dining hall to collect the dishes, Richard's eyes followed him with an intensity that unsettled the others. Laura raised an eyebrow, sensing her husband's unusual fixation, but said nothing. James kept his gaze down, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to notice, that his employer's suspicion had sharpened overnight. Hours later, Richard summoned James to his study. The heavy oak doors closed behind them, and the air thickened with tension. Richard leaned forward at his desk, his voice sharp and commanding. "What exactly do you do after your shift ends?" James hesitated. His calm demeanor remained, but a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. "I only do what I believe is right, sir." Richard slammed his palm against the desk, startling even himself. "Don't play games with me. Are you meeting someone? Are you stealing from me? Spying for someone else?" The accusations flew like arrows, born less from evidence than from Richard's desperate need to regain control. But James did not flinch. "No, sir. I am not your enemy. I have never been." His voice was steady, almost gentle. Richard hated it. Hated the calmness, the dignity in those words. It felt like defiance disguised as humility. He leaned closer, his tone like ice. "Then tell me what you're hiding." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then James replied, "Not everything a man does is for money, Mr. Kane. Some things are done for the heart." The words struck Richard like a foreign language. He froze, confused and angered in equal measure. For a man who believed everything had a price, the idea of doing something beyond money was unthinkable. Laura entered suddenly, sensing the storm. She glanced between her husband and James. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone wary. Richard's jaw tightened. "This man refuses to explain himself. He hides things from me under my own roof." Laura turned to James, her expression softer. "I've never seen him do anything to harm this family. He has always been loyal." But Richard wasn't listening. The walls of his control were cracking, and he couldn't stand it. "You may go," he told James, his voice low but burning with frustration. James bowed slightly and left, his steps unhurried, his posture unbroken. That composure only deepened Richard's fury. How could a servant walk away from such a confrontation without fear? That night, Richard stationed himself at the window, unable to resist. He watched James leave once again, slipping into the darkness like a shadow. The billionaire's heart pounded with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. He needed answers, even if it meant following the man again. Driving with his headlights off, Richard followed James at a distance. This time he was prepared. He watched as James traced the same path, pausing at corners, scanning the streets, then circling back toward the estate. But when strangers appeared near the gates, Richard saw it with his own eyes. James stepped forward with a commanding presence, his simple frame radiating strength. The intruders retreated without a word. Richard's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. He had no explanation. Why would a man work tirelessly all day, then spend his nights protecting a family that barely acknowledged his existence? The next day, unable to hold his silence, Richard confronted his children at the garden. "Has James ever interfered with you? Has he done anything unusual?" His tone was harsh, almost accusing. The youngest, Emily, looked up innocently. "Daddy, James saved me once." Richard froze. "What do you mean?" Her small voice was steady. "I almost fell into the pond. James caught me. He told me not to tell anyone because it might upset you." Richard's world tilted. He turned to his son, Michael, who nodded. "He's helped me too, Dad. When I got stuck climbing the old oak tree, James was the one who got me down. He always says not to tell you because you don't like us talking to him." The billionaire stood rooted to the ground, unable to breathe. All the moments he thought he had control, all the years he prided himself on being the protector of his family. Yet it was James, always James, silently shielding them. That night, Richard tossed in bed, staring at the ceiling. His wife stirred beside him. "What is it?" she whispered. He hesitated, then muttered, "I followed him again. He's been protecting us." Laura turned toward him, her eyes glistening with both relief and quiet reproach. "I've always known he cared for this family. You just refused to see it." Her words stung, but Richard said nothing. He felt as though the foundation of his entire life was crumbling. The following evening, Richard could no longer resist. He called James into the study once more. The man entered calmly, as though prepared for anything. Richard pushed an envelope thick with cash across the desk. "I know what you're doing. You're guarding my house at night. Here, consider this your compensation. No one works for free." James looked at the envelope, then back at Richard. His voice was quiet, yet carried a weight that silenced the room. "I do not want your money, Mr. Kane. I never did." Richard stiffened. "Everyone has a price." "Not me," James replied, his tone unshakable. "My price is my conscience. I protect this family because it's the right thing to do, not because I'm paid to." For the first time in years, Richard Kane was left speechless. His empire of wealth, his fortress of pride, it all felt powerless in the face of such dignity. And you, what would you do if you discovered the man you despised most was the one risking everything to keep your family safe? Would you cling to pride, or would you finally humble yourself? Comment your thoughts, because what happens next will change Richard's life forever. The storm outside was fierce that night, rattling the windows of the Kane mansion. Rain pounded against the glass, and thunder echoed across the estate. Richard sat alone in his study, a half-empty glass of whiskey in hand, yet it offered no comfort. His thoughts were consumed by James, the man he had belittled, dismissed, and tried to control. Every word James had spoken about loyalty and conscience replayed in Richard's mind like a haunting refrain. For the first time, Richard felt powerless in his own house. Wealth, contracts, and security systems had always been his armor, but now he realized how fragile they truly were. His empire could crumble, not by financial ruin, but by the absence of one man's silent watch. Laura entered quietly, her face pale from worry. "Richard, The children can't sleep. They hear noises outside. They're frightened. He set the glass down with a thud. We have guards posted at every gate. They'll handle it. Laura crossed her arms, her voice firm. You and I both know those guards aren't enough. They're here for the paycheck, nothing more. But James, he's different. He cares. Richard turned sharply toward her, his pride bristling. He's just a servant. Don't make him into something he's not. But Laura's eyes didn't waver. He's already proven himself. You're the only one who refuses to see it. Before Richard could answer, the house alarm blared, piercing through the storm. His heart dropped. He rushed to the security monitor, only to see shadows moving along the perimeter fence. Figures, 3, maybe 4 men, were cutting through the darkness with intent. The guards outside panicked, their flashlights flickering aimlessly as they shouted. Instead of confronting the intruders, they hesitated, retreating toward the main entrance. Richard's fists clenched. His expensive security was nothing but a facade. Then, through the rain-soaked cameras, Richard saw him. James. His figure appeared like a phantom in the storm, moving with certainty, positioning himself between the intruders and the mansion. He didn't have weapons, only his steady presence and unwavering courage. Richard leaned closer to the screen, his breath shallow. The intruders stopped in their tracks, clearly unsettled by the man who stood in their way. James didn't shout, didn't falter. He simply advanced with the calm authority of someone who knew no fear. Within moments, the figures scattered into the night, their threat extinguished by one man's will. Richard staggered back from the monitor, shaken to his core. He realized that while he sat in his study with his whiskey and pride, James had once again risked everything to defend the family. Minutes later, James returned inside, soaked from the storm. His shirt clung to his skin, and his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady. Richard stepped into the hallway, words forming on his lips, but pride strangled them before they could leave. He wanted to say thank you. Instead, he only muttered, "You should dry off before you get sick." James nodded once. No resentment in his face, only quiet resolve. He walked past without a word, leaving Richard drowning in his shame. The following days were restless. Richard tried to bury himself in work, but his mind betrayed him. Every meeting, every contract, every deal seemed meaningless compared to the memory of James standing against the storm. His empire suddenly felt hollow. Then came the second night. It was past midnight when Richard heard the sound. Metal against metal, the creak of the side gate. He rushed to the window and his blood ran cold. This time, there were more of them. At least 5 men, armed with clubs, masks hiding their faces. The guards were nowhere to be found. Panic surged through the mansion. Laura gathered the children in their rooms, her voice trembling as she tried to keep them calm. Richard's hands shook as he loaded the revolver he hadn't touched in years. For all his power, he felt like a frightened child. Outside, James was already moving. Richard watched from the balcony as the man he had despised confronted the intruders head-on. Shouts erupted in the garden, the clash of bodies and the thud of blows carried through the stormy night. One of the attackers swung a club, striking James hard in the shoulder. He staggered but did not fall. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward, forcing the invaders back step by step. His body was battered, his breath heavy, but his resolve unbroken. From the balcony, Richard's heart pounded. He wanted to run down, to help, but his legs felt paralyzed. For the first time in his life, the billionaire realized he was utterly dependent on a man he had spent years humiliating. Laura appeared beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Do something, Richard! He can't fight them alone." But Richard stood frozen, shame chaining him in place. He watched as James fought with everything he had, his body moving with the desperation of someone protecting more than just a house, protecting a family. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Police cars arrived, their lights flashing through the rain. The intruders fled, leaving James collapsed on his knees in the mud, his body trembling with exhaustion. Richard rushed down at last, his shoes sinking into the soaked ground. He knelt beside James, gripping his arm. "Why? Why would you do this?" James looked up, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "Because they are worth protecting." Those 5 words cut deeper than any wound. Richard's throat tightened, his vision blurred. For once he had no reply. That night, James was tended to inside the mansion. Laura cleaned his wounds with gentle hands, the children hovering nearby, their eyes wide with fear and admiration. Richard stood in the doorway, watching silently. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to beg forgiveness. But the words were foreign to his tongue. Instead, he simply whispered, almost to himself, "I don't deserve this man." Laura turned her head sharply. "Then start deserving him, before it's too late." Richard left the room, his chest heavy. He paced the empty hallways, haunted by the sound of rain dripping from the roof, each drop a reminder of the storm inside his heart. For days afterward, James continued his duties as if nothing had happened, though his body carried the marks of the battle. Richard noticed the limp in his step, the stiffness in his shoulder. Yet the man never complained, never asked for rest. His loyalty was unwavering, and Richard's shame grew unbearable. One evening, unable to contain himself, Richard gathered the household staff in the grand hall. Laura and the children stood nearby, their eyes expectant. With a voice strained and unsteady, Richard spoke. "This house, this family, we stand because of one man's courage, not because of my wealth, not because of my name, but because of James." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard swallowed hard. "I owe him more than I can ever repay. He is not just an employee. He is the protector of this family. From this day forward, he will never be treated as anything less." Tears welled in Laura's eyes. The children clapped in joy. The other staff looked at James with newfound reverence. But James himself only lowered his head humbly, as though the praise embarrassed him. Richard stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Forgive me, James. For all the years I was blind." The silence was thick. Then James finally lifted his gaze. "I did not do it for forgiveness, sir. I did it because it was right." Those words struck Richard harder than any blow. For the first time, the mighty billionaire felt small, but also perhaps human. "And you? What would you do if your pride cost you the very loyalty that kept your family alive? Would you humble yourself, or would you let arrogance destroy everything? Tell me in the comments, because the final chapter of this story will reveal whether Richard Kane truly changes or remains a prisoner of his pride. The days following the attack felt different inside the Kane mansion. The air no longer carried the same coldness Richard had imposed for years. Instead, there was an undercurrent of gratitude, an unspoken recognition that something profound had shifted. For Richard, however, the change was anything but peaceful. His heart carried a storm of emotions, shame, regret, and a deep longing to undo the cruelty he had inflicted. Each time he saw James tending to the gardens or quietly repairing something around the house, guilt tightened like a vice around his chest. One morning, Richard stood by the window of his study, staring at James through the glass. The man's limp was still visible, a reminder of the injuries he had sustained defending the family. Yet his face remained calm, his posture steady. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only quiet strength. Laura entered the room softly. "You've been watching him for days," she said gently. Richard exhaled. "He should hate me, after everything I've done to him, after the way I treated him." "Maybe he doesn't know how to hate," Laura replied. Her eyes softened. "Maybe that's his strength, and maybe your test is learning to value that strength before you lose it forever." Her words pierced him more deeply than she realized. For years, Richard had equated value with wealth, influence, and power. But now he saw the truth. James possessed something far rarer than any fortune: integrity. That evening, Richard did something he had never done before. He walked out into the garden where James was finishing his work for the day. The air was cool, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass. Richard approached slowly, his heart pounding like a man preparing for battle. "James," he began, his voice hesitant. The worker turned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes, sir." Richard swallowed hard. I owe you an apology. For the years of disdain, for the arrogance, for not seeing you for who you are. I treated you as less than human when in truth you've been the most human among us." The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. James studied Richard's face, then gave a small nod. "Apology accepted, sir. But you don't owe me words. You owe your family the change they deserve." Richard felt his throat tighten, "And I intend to give it to them. But I also owe you my gratitude. You saved us, not once, but countless times. You've been our protector in ways I'll never fully understand. For that, I want you to know, you'll never be just an employee again." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the mansion, where the children's laughter echoed faintly through the halls. His expression softened. "They are worth protecting, always." Richard's eyes burned with unshed tears. "Then help me, James. Not as a servant, but as a partner. Walk beside me, not behind me." The man hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the weight of such words, but eventually he inclined his head. "If that's truly what you want, then yes, I will stand beside you." It was the beginning of Richard Kane's redemption. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation of the Kane household became undeniable. The once cold mansion began to feel like a home. Richard, who had once been distant and feared, now made an effort to be present. He ate meals with his children, listened to Laura's counsel, and even learned to laugh again. James's presence remained steady, but no longer invisible. The staff admired him openly, and the children clung to him like a second father. To them, he was not a servant, he was family. One afternoon, Richard called everyone into the grand hall. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, but the atmosphere was not one of wealth, it was one of reverence. "I built this house with money," Richard began, his voice carrying through the room. "But it stands today because of loyalty, because of sacrifice, because of one man who chose courage when he could have chosen silence." He turned to James. "You taught me that not everything can be bought, that the greatest treasures are not stored in banks, but in hearts. From this day forward, I want everyone to know, James is not just the protector of this family, he is part of this family." Applause filled the hall. Laura's eyes glistened with pride. The children ran to hug James, their small arms wrapping tightly around his waist. The man, humble as ever, simply smiled, overwhelmed by the sudden recognition. Richard approached and extended his hand. "Thank you, James, for saving us, and for saving me from myself." James shook his hand firmly. "Sometimes, sir, saving someone doesn't mean pulling them from danger. Sometimes it means showing them who they could be." Richard felt tears escape his eyes, but he did not hide them. For once, vulnerability was not weakness, it was truth. Time passed, and word of the attack spread throughout the community. Neighbors whispered about the mysterious man who had defended the Kane mansion with nothing but his courage. Some called him a guardian angel, others a silent soldier. But to the Kanes, he was simply James, their protector, their friend, their brother. Richard, once obsessed with appearances, no longer cared about society's judgments. He invested not in lavish parties, but in people. He started funding community projects, schools and shelters, inspired by the very loyalty James had shown him. One evening, as the family gathered by the fireplace, Richard spoke softly to his children. "Do you know what true wealth is?" They shook their heads. He smiled faintly. "It's not the gold or the cars. It's having someone who would stand in the rain, fight in the dark, and protect you without asking for anything in return. That is the kind of wealth no money can buy." The children nodded solemnly, their young eyes shining with understanding. James, sitting quietly in the corner, shifted uncomfortably under their gaze. He was not a man who sought glory, but Richard knew that his story had already etched itself into the hearts of everyone in that room. Years later, people would speak of Richard Kane not as the arrogant billionaire, but as the man who changed, because someone humble showed him the meaning of loyalty. But in the quiet of the mansion, away from the whispers of society, the truth remained simple. The family had been saved not by wealth, but by the silent courage of a man they had once overlooked. And for Richard, that truth became his greatest legacy. Narrator's reflection to the audience. So tell me, what about you? Have you ever overlooked someone, only to realize later that they were the true strength in your life? Maybe it was a friend, a parent, a teacher, or even someone you thought was invisible. Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember that real wealth isn't found in money, but in loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Because sometimes the ones we least value are the ones who guard us the most.